The quasi-elemental plane of vacuum, also called the empty reach or simply the end, is a place of nothingness. While the negative energy plane may be perceived as a void, it's still something, in the sense that it's composed of matter destroying negative energy. And the other three negative quasi-elemental planes of ash, dust, and salt represent the gradual disintegration of matter. But the plane of vacuum exemplifies the utter lack of everything. It is literally nothing. The quasi-elemental plane of vacuum is the plane between the elemental plane of air and the negative energy plane. Any plane between an elemental plane and an energy plane are referred to as quasi-planes, or quasi-elemental planes. Since negative energy represents annihilation and the degradation of all matter, the plane of vacuum is where the plane of air's atmosphere has grown so thin it has become a true vacuum. According to 1st edition, it is a gray void that continuously darkens until reaching the pitch black lightless wall that is the border to the negative energy plane. Unlike the other inner planes, where the sections that border other planes have unique geography and properties, the quasi-plane of vacuum has none. It is endless nothingness all the way through. Travel. How does one get to the quasi-elemental plane of vacuum? Very few portals to this plane exist, as there's few reasons to ever visit here, so no one really makes them. Even the city of Sigil has no known portals to the quasi-plane of vacuum, other than one in the armory, but it vanished. There is a small gate in Pandemonium called the Howling Gate that leads to the quasi-plane of vacuum. The key to open it is simply the touch of air, and as the winds of Pandemonium constantly whip around it, the gate stays perpetually open, dumping drafts of air into the emptiness of vacuum forever. This wind is particularly powerful, akin to that of a summer's gale, so a hapless traveler risks getting flung into the gate against his will. You can also arrive here via elemental vortices. An elemental vortex is a portal that forms in high concentrations of elements on the prime material plane, that then lead to the corresponding element's plane. So a vortex to the plane of fire might be found in a volcano. Vortices to the quasi-elemental plane of vacuum are said to hang in the emptiness between prime material worlds. So once you get here, how do you travel around the plane? Just like most inner planes, the quasi-elemental plane of vacuum has subjective gravity, meaning you can change what direction your down direction is and simply fall that way. Flying with wings or any form of physical locomotion will not work since there's no air. Of course, magical flight will work fine as long as it doesn't mimic wings. Properties. First, let's discuss the physical properties of the plane of vacuum. The first physical property is, well, the actual vacuum itself. The quasi-elemental plane of vacuum has no light, heat, air, or water. One would assume that without heat, the place must be freezing cold, and without air, the lack of pressure would cause you to burst. However, the plane actually does constantly have a slight pressure and cool temperature, is similar to the plane of air, so it's not lethal. Now, this doesn't make any sense at all scientifically speaking, but nothing about the planes really makes sense to our mortal minds. In 1st edition, water, air, fire, earth, ice, and smoke elementals consume their own essence when exposed to vacuum and lose 1 hit die per round, so they never come here. In 2nd edition, it specifies that only gaseous elemental creatures such as air and smoke elementals lose 1 hit die or level per round. I'm not really sure why 1st edition has water, fire, earth, and ice elementals being affected by vacuum. Fire elementals kinda make sense since fire needs air as a fuel source. However, I don't think fire elementals actually need fuel to exist, since they're not made of real life fire, but instead elemental fire, which is its own thing, and as far as I can tell, can it just exist on its own? I mean, there's not really an abundance of like burnable material in the plane of fire since everything's fire. D&D takes the traditional view that the 4 elements make up all matter in the universe, so since fire is one of these foundational building blocks, it can exist on its own without something else fueling it. 5th edition even states that elementals don't require air to survive. The next physical property is something called vacuum welding. So this is a real scientific phenomenon, sometimes called cold welding, where two solids touching in a vacuum can actually weld into one single piece. This is because without air or some other contaminant between pieces of metal, such as dirt or oil, the atoms don't know that they are part of two different pieces of matter, and they just act as one solid mass. In game terms, each round and articulated mechanism, such as a joint in a suit of plate armor or the mechanical arms of a clockwork construct, spins in the quasi-elemental plane of vacuum, it must make a saving throw versus acid, with a +4 bonus applied to simple mechanisms, such as a knee joint for a suit of armor. On a failure, the joint welds and is no longer capable of moving. This can be repaired, but only once moved to a place with a breathable atmosphere. Why the writers whipped out some lesser-known scientific properties for this, but then completely ignored science when it came to air pressure and temperature, I have no idea, but I just assumed they wanted this plane to be somewhat possible for characters to travel to, otherwise you'd never have adventures here. Breathing and senses. Despite pressure and temperature magically existing, there's still no air to breathe, so an unprotected character could only live here as long as they can hold their breath. Spells that transform an element into breathable air, such as the Airy Element spell, are useless here as there's no matter to transform. In 1st edition, vision is limited to 1,000 yards, or 2,000 yards with infravision, which seems really far considering there's no light here. In 2nd edition, it is pitch black, so you'll need a light source to see without infravision. Torches, lanterns, and other light sources that rely on air won't work either. If you do illuminate the place, it'll cast light twice as far since there's nothing to get in its way, and this double vision range applies to infravision as well. Magical properties. You could only summon creatures from a neighboring plane. So for the plane of vacuum, that would be the planes of air, smoke, ice, salt, ash, and the negative energy plane. And anything summoned here will probably just die really quickly. Without air, you can't vocalize the verbal components to cast spells. In 1st edition, any clouds of mist, air, gas, etc. created on the plane of vacuum immediately dissipate. They will still perform their effect the round that the spell is cast, but they won't linger, so any duration is essentially treated as an instantaneous one. In 2nd edition, this same property affects fire-related spells as well, but spells of elemental air simply cannot be cast while on this plane at all. Spell keys, which are methods of casting spells that allow you to bypass certain restrictions, for the quasi-elemental plane of vacuum all take the form of vapors that must be exhaled into the endless void of the plane. This is a problem since most of them are toxic. Additionally, most of the magical restrictions of the plane are simply physical. No amount of spell keys will let air or fire be conjured in vacuum, so I honestly don't know how much use these spell keys are. Encounters. Since the plane of vacuum is a plane of nothing, it's free from most of the hidden dangers that you can unwittingly run into on other planes. The only encounter I could find is something called negative energy phenomena. These are where the border of the negative energy plane begins closing in on the plane of vacuum, taking the form of a giant black wall, moving 3d6 inches per round and lasts 2d10 turns before the border restabilizes. Inches as in inches on the graph paper your battle map is drawn on, not inches in universe. 1st edition had some weird vocabulary, and also a turn is 10 rounds. Those caught in it suffer the effects of the negative energy plane, so you would lose max HP and levels. You can see my video on the negative energy plane to get the specifics. And then you would lose sight of the quasi-elemental border in 1d4 rounds, trapping you on the negative energy plane. Now, as far as I'm aware, every elemental plane has something called elemental pockets, which are pockets of other elements that have found their way into that plane. The hazards section for the quasi-plane of vacuum didn't mention elemental pockets, however later in the Inhabitants section, it does mention that pockets of air can exist. So one would assume that other pockets can exist as well, although for how long, I'm not sure. Inhabitants. While one would imagine a plane of vacuum being devoid of life, this isn't completely true. Natives. So first we have the vacuum quasi-elementals. And in case you haven't figured it out, a quasi-elemental is just an elemental, but it's made out of a quasi-element instead of like one of the 4 main ones. Vacuum quasi-elementals are made out of, you guessed it, vacuum, meaning they are made out of nothing. You can't see them, and if you somehow could, their shape is simply an amorphous, rubbery, hollow skin. However, they can still be dealt damage from physical attacks in first edition, while second edition requires a +1 or better magic weapon to hit, like most elementals. Assuming they are in air or an atmosphere of some kind, they are always drawing in air from around them, treating everything within 60 feet as if affected by a gust of wind spell, and any air-breathing creature in it takes 1d4 damage per round as their breath is sucked out of them. Once per hour, they can reduce a 60-foot cube area of air to an airless vacuum for 10 rounds. Vacuum quasi-elementals are aggressive, wanting to eliminate all matter from their home plane, which they can easily do merely by coming into contact with it. Any attempt to get them as a guide by paying them with their element, like you do with other elementals, have failed, being met with violence. However, they are sociable among themselves, gathering in small groups to converse quite frequently. They are uncomfortable in thick air as they actually tire from using their absorption abilities, and they can't choose not to use them as that's just what happens when a vacuum is surrounded by gas. First edition states that they will flee or enter hybernetic shock if submersed in any environment breathable by prime material beings. Vacuum methods, also known as void methods, don't actually exist, at least not anymore. Rumor has it that they pissed off the quasi-elementals, which began a genocidal war that they then lost. That is how battles in the quasi-plane of vacuum function. They are always over existence or non-existence. Anything less is primal and best left behind. Other than the natives, you have a couple other things living in here. There aren't any animals that are native here, but you can occasionally find a pocket of air with a flock of birds or other aerial creature nesting in it. Although how a pocket of air can even function here, I have no idea. There are vacuum animentals, which are elementals in the shape of animals, but they are extremely rare and reclusive, so you'll probably never find one. When it comes to monsters, you can occasionally find them here, but they have to be a really tough monster to survive the environment, or I guess lack of environment. The book doesn't specify what kind of monsters end up on the plane of vacuum, but they are said to be the same ones that spelljammers find in the vacuum of wild space. And then you have something called Agarus fungus. This is a fungus that feeds on the absence of matter, and it reacts badly to material objects, creatures, and even energy. What exactly it does when you come in contact with it, it doesn't say, but whatever it is, it's not good for mortal life. So other than the natives and the other various creatures I mentioned here, you also have undead. There's a good amount of undead, mostly ghosts and other incorporeal ones, that hang out near the border to the negative energy plane. However, there are two specific undead creatures that are unique to the quasi-plane of vacuum. These are the Spectral Deaths and the Vacuous. Spectral Deaths are negative energy beings that resemble boiling clouds of blackness surrounded by a glowing, sickly black-green aura. Although they're later described as wholly invisible, so I'm not sure how they have a glowing green aura, but whatever. They are solitary creatures and never interact with other natives or even others of their kind. Similar to invisible stalkers, they are flying, invisible creatures that are very good at selecting one target, finding them, and slaying them. If they are summoned by an aerial servant spell, but the spell's duration ends before they kill their target, they become frustrated and try to kill their summoner. Their claw attacks, in addition to dealing damage, require a save versus death magic or the victim loses 1 point of wisdom. Creatures that die this way cannot be resurrected except by a wish spell. And then we have the Vacuous. So, the elemental planes all leak. You can find pockets of fire on the plane of earth, bits of steam in the plane of air, etc. And the negative energy plane is no exception. Sometimes undead spirits from the negative plane come with these pockets, but they're usually drawn back to their home plane. Vacuous are undead that are sucked up by the endless nothingness of vacuum, unable to go back home, taking on the characteristics of this plane. Vacuous are short humanoids with large heads, beady black eyes, and cracked eggshell white skin. Their arms are short with long black talons, and their mouth is a huge gaping maw filled with nothing. It is simply an empty void. Vacuous can create a void inside their body, which then naturally draws in anything around it. This creates a suction, which they can use to suck foes into their gigantic open mouth. This requires a strength save to avoid, and then once inside its mouth, it can choose to make talon attacks that auto-hit or suck them further into its body, engulfing them in the void. While here, the victim must succeed another strength check or be trapped, dying of suffocation and heat loss in 2d4 rounds unless the vacuous is killed. However, doing this also incapacitates the vacuous, so it rarely does this unless the victim is the last one of the party or there are other vacuous around to protect it. Being undead, they feed on living creatures, traveling in packs to hunt. They don't mind traveling to other planes to do so, and they use their suction abilities to great effect, sometimes volleyball tossing people back and forth between two of them, or simply just waiting in ambush and then sucking people up unbeknownst to them. They are not material things, made out of the planar energies of negative energy and vacuum, meaning they are in part made of nothing. Major players. The hostile environment and incursions of negative energy make the plane of vacuum rather undesirable to control, so there are no gods or archelementals that vie for power here. However, there are two known powerful beings layering here. The first is Sun Sing, a powerful and mysterious being living inside a negative energy pocket. Some say he's the last surviving void method. Others claim he's a lich or demi-lich who lives here to avoid all contact with the living, but no one really knows Sun Sing's true nature. Other rumors say he has undead agents scouring the planes for pieces of a puzzle, although whether these are physical pieces or information is unknown. Either way, the only thing we know for certain is he is wholly evil. And then the other being is Zal the Destroyer, a chaotic evil beholder who has adapted to the plane. He is twice as large as other beholders, saves against his rays have a -4 to them and their range is doubled, and he has 3 dozen normal beholders that serve him and they are all immune to vacuum. He lives in a fortress built on a fragment of elemental ice, where he commands an army of quasi-elementals to kill and destroy. Locations. The natives here aren't exactly builders, and it wouldn't be a plane of vacuum if there were cities or buildings everywhere. But there are a handful of places here. You of course have Sun Sing's Sanctuary and Zal the Destroyer's Fortress, but not much is known about them, so they don't get their own section in this video. There's really only one big fleshed out location on the entire quasi-elemental plane of vacuum, and that is Citadel Exhalis. The Doomguard, which is the nihilistic faction in Sigil who believe the multiverse is supposed to fall apart and this shouldn't be stopped, have built the citadel around a gate to the negative energy plane. Here, they contemplate the logical conclusion of entropy. Platforms on its exterior exist, but anyone who goes there will be attacked by devouring spirits of the plane that swoop down. The Dustmen, another faction in Sigil that believe everyone is dead and that this is the afterlife and we're all on our way to true death, come here to revere the plane of negative energy as well. The Citadel also has gates to 5 other locations in the multiverse that the Doomguard holds sway over. They also keep a collection of spheres of annihilation here. Other than Citadel Exhalis, there are a couple other places, but there's not a ton of info on them. One is the Tomb of Sisarth. Rumors persist of a king who was so obsessed with keeping his wealth to himself, even after death, that he commanded his wizard lieutenants to cast his treasure-laden sealed tomb into the plane of vacuum so that no one else could have it, but most people believe this is simply a tale meant to send fools to their deaths. We also have a couple of unnamed citadels here. See, on the border between the negative material plane and its quasi-elemental planes, people report seeing domed citadels, some as big as cities, floating in the negative energy. They are tethered to the quasi-plane of vacuum with ropes made of vacuum to prevent them from drifting into the negative energy. All 4 of the negative quasi-elemental planes have these things just made out of their own element. Tales of who lives here always vary from great monsters and powerful elementals on the verge of becoming archomentals to fell necromancers and powerful liches, but there's really not that much detail on them. And that is everything I could find on the quasi-elemental plane of vacuum. Thank you guys so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video, and remember to subscribe for more D&D related content.